Hi. How's everyone doing? Good. So we'll keep the dialogue going. I'll encourage you to interrupt a little bit, ask questions, make comments. I'm not going to completely rehash what Don has already done, but we will use the 10 types taxonomy as kind of a way for us to convey some of the key learnings and insights that we've had to date. So I've got a little nugget of wisdom or insight about each of them, possibly two in some of the network cases. And I'm sure that each of you have probably had some experience with these types of networks, so if you want to share something that you've learned, feel free to do so. So knowledge networks, I would make a case, if you had a Venn diagram of GSNs, they would belong at the center of the network. They have a very important role to play. Anyone have an idea why knowledge networks ought to be at the center of the GSN universe? No guesses? Well, it's about sharing the learning, but it's also about evidence and data. And when we want to solve global problems, we want to be as judicious and as effective with our resources as we possibly can. We want to have some assurance that what we're doing actually makes an impact, that we can measure results, that we're optimizing the way that we go about addressing global issues. And I think that's what really effective knowledge networks do. They build a transparent and credible evidence base about some of the major issues that we're facing. So if you want to address poverty, you want to have a good sense of that, the interventions that you're running are actually making an impact, that they're making a difference. So the Poverty Action Lab is one of our lighthouse examples in knowledge networks. And the reason we would like Poverty Action Lab is because they actually run experiments. They actually do proper scientific experiments. They run, they run an experiment on a particular intervention in reducing poverty, and then they have they have two communities. They actually compare the results in the two communities. They publish those results, and then they distribute those learnings through a global network of other centers. And they built these poverty action labs pretty much in every continent around the world. Really effective. Everyone says today, I have a theory of change. But a theory of change is not good enough when you want actual evidence and data that things are working. So I think knowledge networks, for that reason, are really important. And Don earlier mentioned Climate and Development Knowledge Network. They do something similar around climate change, adaptation, and mitigation in developing countries. Now here's another insight about knowledge networks. Don mentioned Wikipedia, he mentioned TED, he mentioned Galaxy Zoo. Truthfully, we haven't seen very many knowledge networks that are really truly harnessing mass collaboration in the global problem-solving space, that are doing that with climate change, poverty alleviation, human rights protection, and so forth, with a few exceptions. And one of my favorites, and this is one of our lighthouse case studies, and you'll find the case study on the website, is Open Pediatrics, which is an incredible network around pediatric knowledge. It was initially formed at Boston Children's Hospital, and they've developed a web-based platform for essentially curating best practices in pediatric care. So they now have members and pediatricians in 80 different countries, in 6 different continents, and they have a whole curation system. They have a committee that evaluates all of the contributions. It's all web-based, it's videos. It's, and in some countries where they don't have good systems for teaching the latest techniques in pediatric care, this is enormously helpful for these communities. And it's a huge disruption. I mean, we spoke to the people at Boston Children's Hospital, and they said, the dissemination of medical knowledge hasn't changed in hundreds of years. It's still fundamentally based around the apprenticeship model in individual hospitals. Young pediatricians come into the hospital, they learn from the elder pediatricians. And that's efficient in the context of an individual hospital, but it's not efficient as a system if you think about it, because hospitals are making new innovations all the time. So this is a global platform for transferring those practices and sharing them, especially in developing countries where they may not have access to that knowledge. So 2 insights there about knowledge networks. 1, that they're fundamentally important in terms of evidence and data, and 2, that more of them need to invest in these kind of web-based mass collaboration solutions. Advocacy networks, interesting. We've looked at quite a few of these. One thing we know about advocacy networks is they can be very powerful, they can be spontaneous, they can be unpredictable, they can be influential. What we had a lot of debate about in our team was, were they really effective? And the question was, how do you measure their effectiveness? What is the purpose of an advocacy network? Is it to actually deliver change, or is it simply to raise awareness? And I think the way that we evaluated them depended on what your criteria were for evaluating what an advocacy network does. So you look at 350.org, which is involved in the climate change movement. Have they been so influential that they've managed to get governments around the world to commit to binding carbon reduction targets? No, they haven't. Now they're in a pretty tough situation because economics are mitigating against countries actually making these kind of binding agreements and all of the political economy that goes into that. But then on the other hand, you look at some of the Avaz campaigns that Don mentioned. You look at, for instance, the anti-counterfeiting treaty in Europe. Alain would know all about this in the European Union. This was essentially an anti-piracy treaty, and there was something similar in the US. There was SOPA, there was PIPA. On Avaz, 3 million people signed a petition against the ACTA legislation. 3 million people. Not only that, they had street demonstrations, coordinated street demonstrations across European capitals. European public policymakers were astonished at the level of concern about this legislation. They had no idea, and it mobilized so quickly. The European Union issued, the European Parliament issued a press release actually citing the Avaz campaign as one of the reasons for rejecting the legislation. It was astonishing. So that's an example clearly of an advocacy network actually having an impact. But do advocacy networks make policy? No, not necessarily. Do they deliver services? No, but they can be quite influential. Policy networks, and I'll be perfectly candid with you, I've been pretty disappointed in what we found here. I haven't seen nearly as much innovation as I think could be possible in this space. I mean, we're talking increasingly, Don mentioned, it's a bit of a conundrum, isn't it? Because you mentioned the whole issue of democratic legitimacy and the fellow who founded Avaz saying it doesn't matter. And part of why he's saying it doesn't matter is because if the political institutions are inefficient and if people aren't voting, we'll find other ways to deliver change. But the whole theory of democracy is that everyone should have some form of equal representation, an opportunity to vote and help change policy and legislation. If people with resources and influence and connections simply make decisions and act collectively, they're essentially kind of imposing their view of the world on everyone else, and there's no representative process in that. There's no true accountability. So, I think it's interesting that policy networks are in a position in terms of designing policies where they could be facilitators of meaningful citizen engagement, of real democratic deliberation. Don mentioned some of the tools that are at their disposal in order to do that. Unfortunately, the policy networks that we've seen, for the most part, with a very few exceptions, that are actually in a position to channel that kind of legitimate, true citizen engagement in policies, they aren't fully using those tools. There are some exceptions. Our friends at Evergreen CityWorks are doing the Urban Futures Project. Simon, you know Jeff Cape well. They're still in the infancy stage of this, but their desire is to build a truly global, scenarios-based planning project that would look at the investments, the major investments required in urban infrastructure over the next 50 years or so. Did you want to say anything else about this process, Simon? No. Yeah. So, and they want to do that with true citizen engagement, and they envision a process where you would actually have almost a participatory budgeting kind of process where citizens could actually, say, look, we think the #1 priority is to invest in public transportation, or is to invest in electronic vehicles, or whatever the case may be. So that's an interesting innovation, but unfortunately too few of them are actually doing that. Standards networks, we recently published a report on standards networks that we worked with this on with Ron Shaw, and it's a really solid effort at defining what standard networks are, how they operate, the whole life cycle and evolution of those standards networks. They're fundamentally important. Don described a couple of these in his talk. You're probably familiar with the Global Reporting Initiative. I know, David, you could probably tell us the whole genesis of this network and why it's so important. Just to give you a sense, and then I want to share an insight that I think is interesting about the dilemma that standards networks face. But, you know, the Global Reporting Initiative was set up initially because a whole bunch of companies were reporting on environmental and social performance. But there's absolutely no way to compare one report to another report because they used completely inconsistent measures. And there was no really, true accounting of what, how could you compare two companies. And so GRI was set up to essentially, set up a set of standards that companies could conform to. And that, was a true multi-stakeholder process that emerged, through a dialogue with nonprofit organizations, with some political representation, and certainly with a large number of companies now subscribing to that effort. The Global Footprint Network is kind of a similar process, but it's about measuring the ecological resource consumption of individual nations or different jurisdictions so that you could actually compare that systematically. The big tension, I think, in standards networks is between innovation and consensus. And that's always been a historical tension in standards networks, because as soon as you get consensus on what to standardize, you're in some ways agreeing that that's going to stay a little bit static, right? And there won't be, and that when you speak to the GRI, you speak to the Global Footprint Network, that's the tension that they manage consistently with their stakeholders, is someone who comes up with a better idea or a new process or thinks that the measures should change, and they probably should adapt, and as you get new information, they have to evolve. But then when you get a complex set of stakeholders who have then bought into that standard, evolving it becomes cumbersome and difficult because you have to again kind of win consensus around all of these evolving norms and issues. So that's the big challenge that we've identified in standards networks. Governance networks, if I was to distill a big insight here, is that they're probably the most complex of the networks that we've identified. And it's because governance is really tough, especially when you're dealing with really important issues like marine ecosystems, oceans, forestry, forest ecosystems, and so forth. And my take on this is that most governance networks evolve over the period of a decade, if not more. Rarely is it a big bang kind of thing. Somebody says, let's create a governance network, and it gets up and running. They aren't nearly as quick or spontaneous as, say, an advocacy network. And a good example of this is the Forest Stewardship Council and other similar bodies which are involved in certifying sources of sustainable lumber. And if you know anything about the kind of history of that whole movement, it really started in the 1980s, back when there were organizations like Rainforest Action Network and Greenpeace saying we had to stop logging these old growth forests because pretty soon they were going to be completely wiped off the planet and there would be no old growth forest left. But it took about a decade for companies even to begin to take those kind of processes, those kind of protests seriously. And then it took another decade of negotiation with those activist groups to actually agree to do something about it. And some of the action really didn't come to fruition until the activists got savvy enough not to go directly to the forestry companies, but to go to the retail partners and say to Home Depot, we're going to picket your retail locations until you agree not to buy any lumber from forestry companies that are sourcing that lumber from unsustainable sources. And when the retail organizations said, okay, look, we better do something about this, that's when you started to get action further down the supply chain. So that was an interesting insight into the interplay between a network that kind of evolved from a very confrontational advocacy orientation to something that eventually got agreement and buy-in from industry, retail players, the government, that look, we had to actually define what a sustainable logging operation is. We need standards, we need to certify that. We need a whole governance mechanism to regulate this whole ecosystem. But again, to Don's point, this wasn't something that was driven primarily by governments. It was driven primarily by NGOs and companies. And the same thing is true of the Marine Stewardship Council. In this case, it was Unilever and the World Wildlife Fund that worked together on defining a system for certifying sources of sustainable fish, because Unilever is the world's largest provider of packaged seafood. And they're very influential in the supply chain. World Wildlife Fund said, look, let's essentially replicate the Forest Stewardship Council, but we'll do it for marine ecosystems. So I think we've seen similar types of governance networks.
Can I ask you just a question?
Yeah.
We were talking about earlier the impact sources and
Yeah.
what Rockefeller's doing.
Yeah.
Would you consider that as a governance network? Is they're trying to define what impact sourcing is? And if so,
Yeah.
it seems like it's evolving quicker than a decade. So
Yeah. So that's possible, and it could be that maybe these systems are speeding up in part because we have these precedents now, and we can kind of refer back to these systems, and we know now how certification bodies work in a multi-stakeholder context. So the question was, if you didn't hear, was around impact sourcing. And impact sourcing is actually something I'll talk about a bit more tomorrow, actually a little bit later even in this presentation. But this is the idea that essentially you take outsourcing work and you relocate even a fraction of the global outsourcing work to the poorest and most disadvantaged communities on Earth. And you train marginalized communities with some basic digital literacy. And you say, look, you know, there's work, meaningful work that can be done here. They can make a pretty good wage. Companies would be actually using this as part of their CSR efforts often because, look, they're agreeing to take some of that stuff that they would have sent to, you know, Bangalore or to Morocco or other countries where they have well-established outsourcing industries, and they're going to put it in a rural community in Kenya, you know, for instance, to give you an example. And I think within impact sourcing, there are many different types of networks in operation, and probably the certification of what impact sourcing is might involve governance, for sure. Yeah. And the other interesting insight I wanted to share about governance networks was the difference between hard and soft power. And most of what we see in the governance networks world is soft power, not hard power. Governments, for the most part, are controlling the levers when it comes to hard power, when it comes to regulations or true sanctions, like, you know, enforcing criminal penalties, for instance, or even levying taxes or that sort of thing. For the most part, multi-stakeholder networks have softer tools at their disposal, things like reputation, for instance, and shaming. In some cases, they have, you know, they can set more formal standards like ICANN does with the internet addressing and domain system. The IGF is a bit of a contrast. You know, we would consider that to be almost, I don't know, you know, it's borderline whether it's a policy network or a governance network, because it's not really doing true governance yet. The IGF is the Internet Governance Forum, and this is the place where people are debating some of the really tough policy issues that are emerging in the internet governance space, like privacy and security and data protection and censorship and freedom of expression. Elaine.
There, and I can elaborate elsewhere, but I'm identifying
Yeah. So it's interesting. What would be, I think, really intriguing is if perhaps some governance networks actually took on more more enforcement capability. I think for the most part we're not there yet, but it would be interesting to see how that evolves. Operational and delivery networks, as you remember, Don was describing these as the one that they actually deliver services, and I think when I reflect on the case studies that we've done here and what we've learned about operational and delivery networks, one of the big challenges is the integration of the self-organized networks with traditional service providers. And the crisis mapping is a good case in point here, because this was the big challenge. You know, in Haiti, and Don and I wrote about this in macroeconomics, everyone was very excited about the fact that, well, two things happened. First is people in Haiti had mobile phones, and because they had mobile phones, they could communicate information about what was happening on the ground. Now, traditional relief agencies, like the UN Office of the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs and Red Cross and all of the big major NGOs that go in, had no way to triage that information, or even to track it all down, because it was dispersed all over this place. You know, so what crisis mappers were doing, these were the people that helped aggregate and map this information. They did a fabulous job doing it, but they lacked enough sophistication to understand how these operations actually unfold and how to package that information in a way that would be useful for first responders on the ground. They didn't really understand the protocols about how these communities operate. So it's taken about, you know, that was 2010. It's taken 3 years or 4 years since then to actually evolve a set of partnerships around this whole space through something called the Digital Humanitarian Network, where they've actually defined, they've sat down with the major NGOs, with the major UN agencies, and they've actually defined a set of protocols, and they've actually worked out ways in which the DHN has become a sort of a network of networks. So now you've got many different organizations involved in crisis mapping. When there's a major emergency that breaks out, they go to the Digital Humanitarian Network, and the Digital Humanitarian Network decides which of those networks they should activate based on the particular crisis and what's needed, and whose skills and competencies really need to be brought into this process. And they've written field guides, you know, that decision makers can use. And they've actually done training on both sides, both on, you know, with the major NGOs, but also with the self-organized volunteer communities who need to better understand how they can most be helpful. And they've tried to evolve, you know, more sophisticated mapping technologies too that convey, you know, a better richness of information about what the actual emergencies on the ground are. Because it used to be just, you know, little red dots on a map, which indicated somebody was in trouble, but there was no real granular information about what kind of trouble they were in and what sort of emergency response was required. So everything kind of got, you know, aggregated at a level that was unhelpful on the ground. So now they're thinking, okay, so what's a more granular system of information that could actually deliver more specific information? So somebody has an acute, you know, medical emergency and needs urgent assistance, or there's a bridge that's out. Those are two very different situations, require different responses. So that's the kind of system that they're working on. Platforms, there's a lot we could probably say about platforms. The big insight, I guess we had here, we've had some people challenge us on GSNs in general. And part of what I hear when we speak to people who are a little bit skeptical about this concept is, what's really new here? Haven't we always had multi-stakeholder networks to some degree? And often we say, well, yes, to some degree, but there is something fundamentally different here. And I think what's fundamentally different is that you have digital networks that have powerful capabilities. And those digital networks are enabled, they're the difference between the old kind of analog networks based around, you know, annual conferences and getting together to kind of share information and stuff that can be done in real time with real data that can be visualized, you know, that can get mass collaboration around an issue where you can have big data analytics and open source mapping where you can have petitions and mentoring and, yeah. No, please.
I want to make a comment. Google.
Yeah.
When I was looking at the taxonomy earlier, the taxonomy document, the thing that kind of struck me is everything you're describing is at scale. And what Google's dealing with all the time is scale. And you think of how do we do that? We basically have algorithms. Whether it's determining who comes top of search or all the judgments that we have to make are mostly done by algorithms because it's at scale. And I think as we see more and more of these networks operating globally with more and more data for the decision makers, algorithms will play a bigger and bigger part. And one of the challenges I think is how do you stop the algorithm from being this tyrannical kind of computer saying no? How do you make the algorithm, you know, the revolutionary side of all the networks saying, well, this is how it should change? But there's a challenge, I think, for business and the pressures. The cheapest thing for us is to go for the lowest common denominator, which kind of goes back to the point you were making earlier about operating across multiple territories. We can operate kind of our view of what freedom of expression is, but that costs us a lot of money and cost relationships all around the world. And I think for other companies that are growing up and start to deal with these problems more and more, kind of the simplest, easiest path of least resistance is to say no, is to go to the lowest common denominator, operate in the way that China wants it to, or operate in a way which it's just easier to do business. And I think the algorithm will be the thing that kind of determines that. And I think there's going to be a challenge around lots of these networks when they come up against an algorithm that says no. If you're a company and you're looking at suddenly this big outpouring of data on Twitter, you've probably got a piece of software which is telling you whether or not you need to do anything about this. Maybe it's calculating whether or not these people are actually buying the product. No, you can ignore them. So how do you get the algorithms not to reinforce the kind of tyrannical view of the world? How do you get the algorithms to be more revolutionary?
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting challenge.
Yeah.
Phil at the back. Oh, I'll come back to that in a second. Just want to hear your comment.
Another challenge, which is around machines like Watson.
Yeah.
And the move towards AI.
Yeah.
And centralizing knowledge. Where we're talking about disparate knowledge and lots of networks, but that can all be sucked into what's being described as the singularity.
Right.
And if you combine that with the Internet of Things, then you have the singularity, which is more powerful than individual things, according to the AI people. There's a danger there.
Right. Fair enough. So, but I think what I would say at the present is that our observation is that a lot of the GSNs, truthfully, are not reaching full scale at this point. They're not nearly at the kind of scale that they could potentially operate at. Some are. Why? Well, I think partly because they haven't exploited these opportunities, partly because networks are truthfully hard to build, partly because there are still major divisions in the world around culture and politics and language and applicability, so that and part of what Mark and Don were talking about earlier about clashes of values and norms and so forth. So there are many complex issues, and it's not. I don't want to suggest it's simply about adopting the digital and suddenly you'll be at scale. That's part of it, but it's not the complete answer, because you have to deal with all of those other issues. And so I was going to get into some examples later, but you take something like a topic like education. So it's great, or even agricultural practices, where you have networks like Digital Green, which are featured in Alistair's piece on food security. So Digital Green is a network that tries to identify successful, sustainable practices in agriculture. But in order to disseminate those around the developing countries, you have to translate them into different languages, or you have to try and put it into a visual format that requires no translation, which is not necessarily an easy feat, but people are working on that kind of challenge. Again, these are things that smart people are trying to figure out. Can you crowdsource this? Like, can you put these videos up online and get people around the world to actually do the translation, so you could, so there are solutions, but they're tough, and it's not as easy as flicking a switch and suddenly you're at global scale. So things like crowdfunding and petitions and mapping and digital brainstorming, that can all help, but you also have to realize that a lot of people running the networks aren't fully plugged into this world either. They don't even know some of this exists, so they know how it exists, but they don't have the capacity to invest in it yet, or they're so focused on just day to day trying to solve the problem that creating the time to actually think about how to adopt this and who to partner with to make it happen is very difficult. It's non-trivial, for sure.
Can I just ask a question? This may be a totally basic question, so excuse me if I'm wrong. In taxonomy, platforms seem a little bit anomalous in that they almost don't seem like networks. They seem like accelerants of the networks, tools that networks use to become more effective, more efficacious. Right? And I just wonder, maybe one of the reasons we don't see the rapid development of some of these networks is the failure to adopt platforms and technology as an accelerant. They're fundamentally too human, right? They have the failures of human interaction, but also the benefits of human interaction. So they're getting all the energy that you have from multiple people engaging around a single subject. But coming to the point about the singularity beats that. AI beats that, right? And the question is, how do we use platforms to improve the effectiveness of those networks? And maybe we should be thinking as platforms as a different factor in the taxonomy. It's an enabler as opposed to a network in its own right.
I think it's true, and I think collectively we would agree with that. I mean, in the sense that I have yet to see a platform yet that is a true multi-stakeholder entity, in the sense that the organization that provides the platform is a multi-stakeholder entity. Many platforms are used by multiple different stakeholders, therefore they enable, to your point, GSNs and multi-stakeholder communities. But most of them are controlled by a social enterprise or even a for-profit enterprise.
Platforms seem to be a connection of hard technologies and soft technologies that are coming together to enable outcomes and to deliver those things. And what I start to see where platforms are working really effectively is being able to harness technology with social technological evolution to be able to accelerate an outcome. And for me, it's about training people to develop, harness, and then unleash those platforms, and seeing how many of those platforms can be multi-stakeholder in terms of multiple networks.
Open source software is both made by people and as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah.
I think this is a potentially spiraling in a good direction debate, because there's two thoughts. One is that I think may get in the way of conceiving what a platform is. One is something that's globally vertically integrated, by an organisation, and thinking of an algorithm to optimise something globally, versus horizontal integration. Again, open source. I've got my Power Network. I've got my Linux server. I've got some code. I'm only one, and I provide a platform that collectively. So I think one thing might get in the way is global vertical integration. Another thing is, you just mentioned organisations, because we kind of think of global vertical integration and we think of organisations, but a platform might not be anything. In fact, it might not even be a brand, but it might be a capability that comes together because there's a lot of hackers, a la Occupy or something else, does spontaneously provide an enduring capability, which is a platform that actually draws on Google, Amazon, Linux, or whatever, to provide a platform that has a common philosophy. I think this, just even thinking about what a platform is could be a hot debate.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, go ahead.
I see an untapped potential in combining platforms with policy. I think I can feel that there is space there, because we still think of policy in a sequential form, first knowing then acting, while on the ground the GSN and the old people just act and correct and prolong the prototype strategy.
Yeah.
And I think there we have an untapped potential.
I fundamentally agree with you, and that was my point on the policy networks, that too few of them were exploiting platforms, essentially, that could enable real, genuine citizen and stakeholder engagement in policymaking. It's a total untapped possibility. Phil?
I can see platform being a really good balance in terms of power between the populace as a whole and the singularity. So in other words, the great power of the singularity needs something to balance it, otherwise there's stuff. And seriously, I think the power that's within platforms and the growth of platforms and the education of people about platforms is critical.
Yeah. Oh. Alistair?
Yeah, just a very quick comment about platforms. And in my view, platforms can't survive on their own. I think these many platforms are largely dependent on some other networks, like governance networks. And actually, I've seen some the activities on some online platform on the decline. the life expectancy of certain platforms is a question, because the energy and the commitment of volunteers can be withdrawn anytime.
Yep.
And the platforms, if the platforms organizers are not active in engaging the people who try to work through the platforms, the platform will die pretty soon. So I think if the platform are partnered with governance network or some other things like that, the life expectancy of the platforms could be a bit longer.
And what if the platform blocks you in? And if you built up 32 million people behind a campaign, it's on one platform, you're kind of tied into that outcome.
Yeah, I was going to bring up a similar point. Is one of the things that I think about as I look at these networks is a little bit of, you can think about it as the work or what's happening between them, and the role of the platforms might hopefully be stewarding or moving it along. And so even when I see these categories, I'm like, as soon as we excel in one, it's about how do we combine it to the next, to the next. And I think that to see that true large-scale change, we're going to have to figure out a way that the data is shared, the activity is shared, that it's moving at the same pace, and that, I mean, huge opportunities, but
the links between these are all very task-oriented.
Yeah.
The links between
Yeah.
tasks is
Yeah.
the more important piece of the
Yeah.
platforms,
and
Absolutely.
not the
Your
tasks
point?
themselves.
Yeah.
without, without the platforms themselves, it's our interactions to them. It's is someone stewarding that engagement or that activity? Is the information really relevant? Can I trust the information? So there's so much to it. And again, whether this is the platforms can truly enable and hold the whole from a data perspective.
Yeah, they can't provide the whole picture. You very much need all of the other dynamics that you pointed to. Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to move on to another one here. Watchdog networks. A couple insights about watchdog networks. One is that of all the networks, they tend to be the most technologically sophisticated. And I think because they have a role in transparency and surveillance and in monitoring, they've been fairly enthusiastic adopters of technology for the most part. And Don mentioned Global Forest Watch quickly. I just wanted to provide a bit more information about this one because it's one of my favorite case studies, and I think it's an excellent example of a true GSN, conceptualized initially by the World Resources Institute, and it's essentially it's a global satellite monitoring system for forest, and actually Google is a partner with this. The United Nations Development Program is involved in this. A whole range of companies and different stakeholders are involved in the Global Forest Watch community. What's interesting is they've just gone through Global Forest Watch 2.0, and the new release is incredibly powerful. So they have, one of the partners is NASA. So NASA has lent them their satellite monitoring and imagery capability to use as part of Global Forest Watch. So now every 2 weeks, they have an update of the status of the world's forest globally. Used to be that forest data was updated maybe once a year in the most advanced industrial countries. And in most developing countries, it was updated almost never, maybe every 5 or 10 years. So we had really no sense of what the true status of the world's forest ecosystems was like until Global Forest Watch has provided this. And again, maybe individual countries did, but this data was not shared publicly, and now it's being shared publicly with everyone. The other interesting thing is that they've actually built, to your point about algorithms, they've built algorithms to interrogate the data. And from the algorithms, they can automatically detect changes in forest pattern coverage. So that it used to be, again, until these algorithms were built, and this is only in the past year, so this is brand new capability, that people literally had to print out images and compare them, and compare and contrast, and essentially overlay them like a transparency to tell if there was an actual change in forest coverage in a particular location. So it was hugely time and person intensive. And you had to have people who were trained in studying these images to do that kind of stuff. Maybe you could have crowdsourced it, but this is even better because now computers can automatically detect the changes. The big challenge with the system remains, how do you know what's driving the changes? What's actually happening on the ground? Is it a forest fire? Is it illegal logging? Is it legitimate logging? Is it farmers clearing it for pasture? So these are all questions that you can't tell immediately from the satellite imagery. And so this is the other thing that's extremely powerful about this network, is they've built a global network of NGOs which then do the on-the-ground analysis. So, somebody detects something happening in Indonesia, they contact the local NGOs and they say, look, over the past couple of months we've noticed a rapid decline in force coverage in a particular region in Indonesia. Go out and check out what's happening. So the local NGO goes out, takes pictures, documents, and they upload that to the system. It becomes globally available so that they can do real-time analysis, but also have the local crowdsourcing so they actually fundamentally understand what's happening on the ground. Then they can begin to implement solutions around that. So it's a good example of a truly kind of robust watchdog network that leverages both the human networks, the satellite monitoring, the whole picture. So one of the best that we found, this one on the right is kind of interesting. It's a bit in its infancy, but it's BICOT basically. It's a mobile phone enabled system where you can scan a product, its barcode, and you can pull up information about the product. And in some cases, the information can be very detailed. They develop company profiles. They try to get information about how the products were sourced and where the raw materials or ingredients for the products may have come from, possible ethical issues. But I think in terms of sheer robustness, Global Forest Watch is by far the most interesting. So I'm going to pause there. I have a couple other slides, but I wanted to invite more comments. Yeah, Janet.
I'm almost embarrassed to ask this question, but I noticed in the taxonomy that the word social isn't in there.
Right.
And maybe that is deliberate, and the thinking, in terms of how the social networks influence or link in, So I can think of a specific example that a lot of the young people we work with, if they're looking to solve their economic problems and challenges, rather than when they start their small business, set up their own website, they set it up on Facebook, because then they can get recognition, they can use their friends to promote, they create markets for themselves and things like this. So there's a linkage somewhere along that. The closest thing, the diaspora network, in terms of the social. So I was just curious as to the thinking behind that. And,
I guess a lot of the networks inherently have a social element. I don't know if you would add anything to that, Dawn. I don't think we were excluding social networks per se. I think we were kind of thinking that almost networks, by definition, most of them anyways, have a social piece to it. Yeah. But I see where you're possibly creating a dimension, but also don't forget.
Again, you look at young people.
We didn't want to.
It's from the linkages, but Mary's talking about how that links in.
Let me just make one other, sorry, Victoria, then I'll let you jump in. But just to clarify, we also didn't want to include every kind of network in the taxonomy because we're talking specifically about global problem-solving networks that are multi-stakeholder. So your friend network or your social network is not, that would be kind of conflating the whole thing a little bit. Still, I would argue that many of these networks are still very social in nature. Victoria.
It just ties it back to the platform discussion a little bit, though, when you think about scale. So many of those platforms end up being, even the ones that are effective and are matched by the offline activity in a very balanced way, they end up so siloed. And so when we were talking about connecting them up, but if you also just connect them up to the kind of major social network platforms, you instantly have much greater potential for scale.
And many of them, the smart ones, are doing that. They're trying. Some of them, actually.
With the data, not just the Facebook one.
Yes, I hear you. Yeah, fair enough.
But actually integrating with data.
Don, you want
to? The other thing I'd say is that, most of these social networks are platforms upon which other types of GSNs get built. Facebook Causes has like 80 million people involved in that. Twitter is used for, I don't know if it'd be all 10 types, but probably advocacy, knowledge creation, you name it. Operational and delivery. During the early days of the Syrian debacle, if you were a student and you got injured in the street, you'd get picked up by an ambulance, taken to a hospital. You go in with a bullet, with a broken leg, you come out with a bullet in your head. So these two young people created an alternative healthcare system on Twitter, emergency healthcare. You get picked, tweets go out, you get picked up, you get taken to a makeshift medical clinic where you get medical attention as opposed to being murdered. So that would be an example of a platform, Twitter, being used to perform now it's local in the sense that it's in Syria, but I suppose governments repressing their citizens is a global problem. So in a sense, and there were businesses involved, there weren't governments involved, but there were NGOs involved. And actually there were physicians and medical people that were sort of quasi-government. So you could argue that Twitter was a platform for a GSN of the operational and delivery type. So we haven't really, Twitter and Facebook and all the traditional social networks are not on our platform thing. I mean, I don't know, we've talked about them.
You know what, in some ways I kind of thought it's obvious, so I didn't bother putting them, but it's a good point. Yeah.
It seems to be obvious.
Yeah.
There's something there
Yeah.
that needs to, whether it's from the data or the linkages.
And I think the data point is really important, because I think the better we get at big analytics and able to move that out of companies like, you know, Google and IBM having all the mind share of knowledge around how to do big data, and we can push it out, then the nature of these networks will change. So like the watchdog networks are really becoming knowledge networks, because the more they know about the forest,
Yes,
and the more
you're right,
data
you're
you
right,
have
you're
about
right.
the way the forest works,
Yeah.
well, now we have knowledge about whether this is actually an anomaly. Is it just nature doing its work, or is
Right.
it man-made? Is it other things? And then what do we do about
Right.
it? That turns into now a knowledge network. So
This is
for
true.
me, the interrelations between networks evolving and becoming new and different kind of networks
That's
is
an
almost as
interesting,
interesting as the types itself.
It is, and the point I made earlier about sort of from advocacy to governance, and now you're suggesting from watchdog to knowledge is indeed, and maybe it's watchdog to knowledge to governance or
Right,
something,
right,
right?
exactly.
Which is truthfully one of the most interesting things. I agree.
What's your thinking, or have you started thinking about competition within these networks? Because what I find is fascinating is again, even as you showed examples, right? In private sector, we deal with competition. Sometimes we work together, sometimes we don't. It's at least part of our business planning.
Yeah.
As you get into networks, in theory, right, there should be ways that all networks become networks of networks. But what's your thought about how there is inherently competition within each one of those network archetypes?
Types, yeah.
And that you don't have necessarily traditional market forces to tease that out.
Yeah, the market forces and the competitive dynamics are there, but they're not as ruthless and as strong as they are in a true marketplace.
Yeah.
I think there's a greater tendency to get duplication and redundancy, and that's a well-recognized problem within the broader nonprofit space, I think, because of the lack of coordination, because of the lack of competitive dynamics between different networks. I think there's a bit of a balance. On the one hand, because you want some redundancy, but not too much, and that resources are being that you have, and you want some innovation too. You want a competition between different types of approaches. So you don't want to fund only one network. So they do compete for funding. They do compete for support and legitimacy and so forth, and influence for sure. That's they compete for influence. Victoria, I'd be kind of curious. This is kind of part of your space. I'd love to hear your thoughts on that question.
Well, I was just thinking about the last comment about when a watchdog network becomes a knowledge network, and I was thinking about some of the nonprofits I know that are beginning to amass, not big data, but let's call them medium-ish data. And they're beginning to see that as an asset, right? And so first it's for their own practice, and they can improve it if they figure out how to analyze it properly, and there are people doing that. But then there's also, it can be an asset in lots of other ways, and it kind of goes back to the value thing. And because there is a pressure to have sustainable business models, and funders put pressure on networks to have sustainable business models. And I think it's a very real challenge, and I was just making a note to ask at one point how you've tackled across all these GSNs, what are the business models? As I was reading some of the research and some of the case stories, it's sometimes alluded to, but to pick that apart and which business models work for which networks would be really important to know.
So I'll go to you in a sec, Simon. Just to answer your question about that, it's on the research agenda list of things to tackle, and it's not the first time the question has come up, but we do need a systematic way for addressing that question, because I agree it's vitally important, and there's new mechanisms today that didn't exist previously to address some of the fundraising questions and the sustainability questions. But we don't have the definitive answer for you yet. Simon?
Yeah, actually it was a related comment to that, which is, I'm really interested in the economics of this, because when I think about the role of social enterprises, most of the networks you're talking about relate to the resolution of large social issues.
Yeah.
That often don't have the private sector particularly focused on, because the private sector ultimately is about selling stuff to people, organizations. As opposed to solving global problems. And as a consequence, who's funding this, right, is kind of the question I'm asking. And I'm guessing that in most cases it's either large philanthropic groups that are doing it as a social outcome, or it's government which is funding it, or some combination of the two, plus some CSR.
Some member-driven organizations, so the certification bodies, they derive some fees from membership and certification and so forth, as an example. But
I suspect the answer is there aren't that many successful business models, self-sustaining business models that exist in this space. And until you get into a position where we value societal outcomes, environmental and social outcomes, in the same way that we value economic outcomes, it's really hard to imagine a self-sustaining business model. And the inherent problem in that is, I'm struggling to think how the private sector, big private sector organizations, will want to engage with this. There may be individuals in those organizations, like probably the people in this room, who are particularly interested in the issue. But when we go back into commercial day-to-day and start talking to the COO, CEOs that Mark was talking about earlier, how do you get them engaged when ultimately they're looking at quarterly reports, they're looking at the commercial interests, and they're just saying, well, all this is really fascinating and great, but actually, in some cases, we trade on information asymmetry.
Yeah.
We're not interested in developing information symmetry.
So I agree with you, and I think that the accounting systems fundamentally probably have to evolve. I just wanted to, because it directly addresses your point, just raise two quick examples of, because this is where advocacy networks come into play and why they can be very important, because they make it impossible in some cases for companies to ignore these issues. And the two examples that I'm thinking of are chocolate and the cocoa supply chain and conflict diamonds. And we could add other ones. We could add the forestry issue and the ocean issue. But these two examples both came about as a result of concerted, decades-long campaigns in some cases shorter. Cocoa was maybe a bit shorter, but the issue with cocoa is that you had organizations like Free the Slaves who said, look, there's child slavery in the cocoa plantations in West Africa. And initially, the chocolate companies said, well, what does that have to do with us? We buy our cocoa on the commodity exchanges in Chicago. We don't control the supply chain. We just buy the raw commodity. We have no control over that. And the NGO said, no, I'm sorry, you derive the profits, therefore you have responsibility. And eventually, their campaigns were so aggressive that the companies had to concede that I guess maybe we do have some responsibility. But it wasn't, in the absence of that pressure, they wouldn't have voluntarily adopted to take responsibility. So now they have the International Cocoa Initiative, which hasn't solved the problem yet, but they're working towards, all right, how do we source this stuff sustainably and fairly and equitably and develop, standards and systems and so forth. And the conflict diamonds process was very similar. De Beers, again, very little transparency, actually deliberately opaque in the supply chain, wanted to obscure the source of the diamonds, but NGOs again made it impossible for people to ignore that, and they got a worldwide coalition. They got 74 governments involved. They built a certification system. Again, it hasn't resolved the issue fundamentally, but it's building towards a solution.
But both those cases are targeting the moral license to operate that Mark was talking about. They're
Correct.
playing on the fact that you're targeting a moral license to operate rather than an immoral license to operate. Now, that's okay, but they will only react under duress if they believe that their future revenues are at risk as a consequence of losing their moral license to operate.
Right.
Now, that's not a great negotiating position for engaging private sector organizations. If you don't engage, we're going to hurt you, right?
But it's worked. That's the thing. But I agree. but
it's only, remember, we're talking about advocacy networks here.
Yeah.
You know, we're not talking about
But
the
I
other
think
nine types.
That's quite peculiar to an advocacy.
No, but yeah, by definition, that's what they are. It's we're going to lean on you until you change your behavior, and we'll use transparency and everything else we got to force you to behave differently. That's what it is.
Bob?
I think, as you were just saying, that's the fundamental aspect of all these. When I look at this, like, this all comes down to, unfortunately, money.
Yeah.
And either who's donating it and who's deriving money from it. Ultimately, corporations change because, yes, you can bring great political pressure to them. It impacts their money.
Yeah.
Therefore, they will make the change up to the point that they have to.
Yeah.
Right. No more, unless there's an economic benefit to it.
Yeah.
So one of the, I think, rather than I'll beat you over the head, show me as a corporation, how do I make more money? That is going to change the boardroom more than, this is the right thing to do. I don't think any boardroom will say we disagree.
I don't disagree with
you. But
you.
at the end of the day, we have our fiduciary responsibility. So how do you balance those?
I hear that, but realistically, some of these issues are incompatible with let's make more money, because it's just not that. I mean, you're talking about paying people more. You're talking about investing more in environmental protection. Now, yes, in some cases, the environmental stuff, when you get into circular economy, closed loop, can be more efficient, can, reduce costs and so forth. But you still need to make huge upfront investments in changing production processes, which can cost a lot in the short term, which gets back to the whole quarterly results and on and on and on.
Unless you put an economic value on a positive externality.
Right. Right.
Suggest there's such a thing as profiting out.
Right.
It's a crazy idea, I know.
Yeah. Anyways, this discussion could go on and on and on. It's 5 o'clock. It's after 5. We're supposed to wrap up. I had a bit more I was going to share, but I think it's been fruitful. So we'll maybe leave it there for now. And yeah, David, you wanted to say something just before we wrap up?
Can you give us a bit of a sense of how many global solution networks you think you have already mapped?
Yeah, well, detailed investigation. I mean, just identified. So Tom Hale, who's going to speak tomorrow morning on the panel, he's one of our partners here at the Blavatnik School of Government, and has done the network orchestration piece, which is a fabulous paper, which I'll recommend. We'll get into the details. He's identified, with us about 200. I won't claim to say that's a definitive sample of GSNs or exhaustive for that matter. But clearly we're talking about hundreds. Now again, depends on how rigorous you are about the application of the taxonomy, which we were talking about earlier, David. And do they meet all of Don's 4 requirements? And that's a bit debatable. But a good conversation to have for sure. Okay, I'll leave it there. Oh,
you just made me think also about going back to the global. I'm like, wow, I haven't even thought about the criticality of having great regional solution networks.
Right.
And if we look at social issues like that,
yeah.
Play a huge part. Does it have to be global, or does it just have to be at scale?
No, and to Don's point, a lot of the networks that we've described are not truly global. They're addressing a global problem, but they don't have global scale yet. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thanks so much, everyone.
John, you have a couple of remarks you'd like to share, and then we're going to have to wrap up in about 5 so we can get to our dinner on time.
Just 2 points on that last one. Yeah, we were very careful to say the problem is global. The network doesn't have to be global. In fact, there are very few truly global networks that are everywhere in the world. I mean, the internet itself would probably be one of them. But just another thing that I didn't mention on that. When we say solving a global problem, we also there's in parentheses, as defined by a reasonable person. For example, Al-Qaeda. Are they a global solution network? They're multi-stakeholder. They think they have a problem that they're solving, the Great Satan or something like that. They use a digital revolution very effectively. They're self-organized. They're not controlled by a state or state. But a reasonable person would not say that Al-Qaeda is trying to solve a global problem. Now, you get into gray areas with stuff like anonymous. I mean, in some extremes of anonymous, a reasonable person would say that that's just a vigilante thing or it's pure destruction, but there are other parts of anonymous that a reasonable person would say, hey, they're just trying to expose injustices or crime or corruption or inappropriate authoritarian behavior by corporations or governments and so on. So that's kind of a whole sort of gray one for us. I just wanted to say one thing about the taxonomy, which is that, who was I talking to out there used the word organisms, like an organism? Yeah, that was you. Okay, thank you for that. So it's like you have a whole bunch of organisms that you're looking at, and they're all kind of good organisms, and you want to help them move forward. But it turns out that they're quite different. Like one, if you give it a little electric stimulation, it grows and scales and gets better. But another one, you kill it. One, you give it some water and it grows and gets better. Another, you drown it. And that's why we wanted to, I know this taxonomy thing is so, we're beating you over the head with it, but it's so important because now these are very different. You know, advocacy networks, as we were just talking with Simon, they really behave very differently. Some of them you can build a social entrepreneurship model in where you have a for-profit motive. Others, you can't. So whatever problem in the world that you're passionate about, I'd encourage you to stand back and think, whoa, am I approaching this the right way? Maybe there's one of the other types of networks that might be more effective. And I'll just end with a story. Stephen Lewis is a wonderful human being. And he was the head of the New Democratic Party in Canada, the Social Democratic Party. And he was also the Canadian ambassador to the UN for many years. And he's also a great, you know, one of the greatest statesmen of the last century. And he's taken on, is working with a bunch of women. He's got a great passion, which is the issue of gender violence, basically rape. And so in talking about this whole way of how to build a GSN to attack the problem of rape, we looked at all the different network types. And normally people default rape. Wow, we're going to create an advocacy network and we're going to advocate that prosecutors in India who say that rape is sometimes justified, that they should be fired, or that government ought to prosecute all rapes, or that whatever. Maybe you should create an operational and delivery network that creates self-defense mechanisms for women in some areas where rape is rampant. Maybe we should create a whatever. And he says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to create a knowledge network, because it turns out that women don't self-report for different reasons, right down in some case to the village level. So if we can diagnose on a global scale, why, maybe it's not, maybe it's a watchdog network, I don't know. But if we can diagnose why women don't self-report, then we can start to work on the actual material conditions or cultural conditions or whatever that would enable them to report and that would enable prosecutions to occur. So it's just, to me, it was a really instructive example of how you now got these 10 tools, if you like, to attack a problem. I took a whole bunch of notes. I thought the conversation was super interesting. I think we have some more projects that we need to work on. One is the evolution of networks. Are there any natural trajectories, or should there be? Another is is longevity. Like people say, well, how do you make a network built to last? I'm not sure you want to. Sometimes it's good to have a network that's just a pop-up. So I think we need to deal with that some more. And then there's this whole issue that we've been delaying because we just need to get all this basic stuff done. But it's just the interrelationship between these networks and how you can get synergy from them where the whole might be greater than the sum of the parts. So to be continued.